Child sexual abuse is a global problem and a serious crime in every country. We know that it affects more than 1 billion children globally and 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys in the US and 1 in 5 children in Europe. It's not a rare circumstance. It's all too common. In fact, if you're watching this, you may know someone who survived child sexual abuse, whether it's a loved one or a friend or a neighbor or a colleague. So we're so grateful for your interest in protecting children, and we're equally grateful for the support of the Caring Foundation in making sure that you learn through these modules today how to take steps to protect children, how to intervene if you suspect abuse, what to do if a child discloses to you, and most importantly, how to keep the loved ones around you safe and protected. Thank you so much for participating, for helping, and sharing this information with others.
As a culture and as a society, we kind of have to think about societal risk factors. And so when we sexualize young people, that could desensitize them to sexual content and such that, people might be more apt to cross those boundaries and may be less apt to detect it because of it.
The internet is really an amplifier for child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse has existed since the beginning of time. But with the advent of the internet, children are at risk, not just from folks who are in their everyday life, their family, their extended family, their school, their community, but anyone from around the world can exploit them. And when you think about that, this just grows the effect of child sexual abuse and places children at even more risk of child sexual abuse.
When a household experiences a level of dysfunction, that there's substance abuse in the household, there's mental illness in the household, there's loss of a parent through death, through incarceration, even through divorce in a household there, if a child's witnessing domestic violence in a household, those factors can increase the likelihood that a child becomes a victim of child sexual abuse.
So what we know from the research literature is that it's vulnerable kids who are targeted for sexual abuse. And so these are kids that are vulnerable because of psychological vulnerabilities. They feel lonely, ostracized, they might have mental health problems, or they're physically vulnerable because they lack supervision.
The public tends to view child sexual abuse as uniquely unpreventable. And that's because they view people who engage in these behaviors as non-human, right? As monsters. So I think of people who have committed child sexual abuse as monsters. I mean, if you think about a monster, their behaviors are not predictable and they're not preventable. Also, if you think about monsters, those are not the people in your lives. Your stepfather, your coach, your teacher, your uncle, your brother, they're not monsters. They're people that you love, maybe people that you admire.
We know that perpetrators tend to have more dysfunction, and they might have pedophilic interests, they might have substance abuse problems, they may have been abused themselves. And so whenever you see, situations where there's instability, that increases the likelihood that child sexual abuse could happen. Sexual grooming is the behavior that a perpetrator engages in by selecting a vulnerable victim, gaining access and isolating that child, and then gaining trust of that child, their family, institutions, and communities.
There are a couple of things we need to know about grooming. One is that it's not just the child victim or potential victim that's being groomed. It's also the adults surrounding the child that are essentially being groomed. Because what a perpetrator is doing is essentially trying to separate the child from the adults in their life that care about them and are protecting them. They're trying to isolate the child from the eyes and ears and sight line of people who would notice something's going wrong.
Grooming is a tactical relationship building style, right? It's a level of manipulation. It's building a relationship of trust for the intention of coercion.
One of the things that we know is that when you describe grooming behaviors on the part of a perpetrator, whether you're describing it to kids or adults, some of the most low-level activity sounds so much like things you might expect anyway, right?
Often what adults will do is try to engage a child in ways that make the child feel special. Give them gifts, give them extra attention.
I think normal behaviors in relationships between adults and children can exist, and normal things like gift giving or spending quality time with a child, or bonding over common interests, even potentially.
It's not difficult to make a child love you, right? And we want adults to make children love them. Kids need that. But then it's also really simple to turn that into child sexual abuse if somebody wants to do that. It doesn't take much time or energy at all, really.
The other thing that perpetrators do is try to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. So first of all, they try to do that with the child, and we can talk about all the sort of nefarious ways they do that. But another key thing to keep in mind is they do this with the adults around the child too. So it starts out with, well, your child is staying late from school or at practice. Can I just give them a ride home too? Would that help you out? To a stressed parent, that sounds really great. And then maybe next time it starts happening with more frequency. Well, I drive by this way all the time. It would be no problem to me every day to take your child home from practice or school or music lessons or whatever. Then it becomes, well, would you mind if we stopped and just had an ice cream on the way home, or stopped by a store or played some video games or whatever? No, once in a while, that's fine.
But if you see them in high frequency, and if somebody is singling out a single child, that is suggestive that they might be grooming them, and you need to put additional eyes on that child.
Where we go from normal to problematic is when there are secrets kept, when the gift giving is intended to make one child feel different or isolated from another.
So showing the kid more attention, which can be a positive behavior. But then as they get closer to the abuse in terms of time, that's when the boundaries are more likely to be crossed.
And then it becomes, well, that's a weekly thing, or maybe even a daily thing where we just make this diversion. Now, well, we have this family cabin and this family vacation. Would it be okay if little Johnny, who would really love to go, came with the family on vacation, or we're away for a weekend? That doesn't sound so bad if you've been allowing all these other things, right? This is like Uncle Ted now, who is the family friend, the trusted relative. And then it becomes, well, the family's really not going, but I'm going to be going fishing. Would it be okay for a little Johnny to go with me? Well, just by himself and just by myself, just fishing. Well, that doesn't seem so bad because you've already done all these things. It's important for the adults in a child's life to be paying attention to this escalating request, these pushing of personal boundaries. Then you start to understand how much attention and how intentional it really is what perpetrators are doing to try to separate kids from their families, but also to make families willing to accept that separation.
Other behaviors like talking to kids about your own sexual experiences, those were all behaviors that were found to be significantly different at between 3.5 and 7 times more likely among children who'd been experiencing sexual abuse.
You have an adult who's asking the child or adolescent to describe their own sexual experiences back to them. Huge red flag.
They're testing out to see whether, the child will report if they engage in those types of behaviors, whether people will detect if they're engaging in them. We found that behaviors that involve sexual content and physical touch differentiated significantly between kids who experienced sexual abuse and those did not, 6.5 to up to 30 times. It is at that point that usually the contact sexual abuse takes place. And then afterwards, they engage in post-abuse maintenance behaviors such that they prevent the child from disclosing the abuse and they are not detected.
I think you have to think about it this way. If you have a child that is saying, I don't want to go over to so-and-so's house anymore, or I don't want to spend time with this person anymore, or after they spend time with that person, they seem sad, upset, weepy, silent, withdrawn, any of that. It doesn't mean that they definitely have been sexually abused, but it definitely means that the adults in their life need to ask, what's changed? What's making you upset? Why do you always seem quiet after you come back? Why do you seem nervous? Why do you seem anxious when we talk about going to Uncle Ted's house or whomever it is? Because kids often think they've told an adult when they haven't said the words, but they've been doing all of these things to try to avoid the person that they feel unsafe with. And we need to be able to be paying attention to that change in behavior, because that alone is a potential sign of abuse. And when you marry it with those signs of grooming, it's an enormous red flag.
I think as a parent who's wanting to protect their child, if you see some red flags, the number one tool to mitigate that is definitely the communication that you have with your child.
If you think you're being groomed as a parent or as an adult, you then need to make sure that your minor is safe and not spending time around that individual. If that individual is part of an institution, talk to people at that institution, let them know about your concerns so that you can have additional eyes on that person and they can have additional eyes on your minor. If it's somebody within your family, you want to make sure that that person is not spending time alone with your child.
The reality is, if you feel like you have to report someone, ideally, maybe there are other adults in that environment who've noticed things as well, right? We want to create environments where adults are talking to each other, that they know what grooming is, that they know what behaviors are inappropriate.
Ultimately, children want to know that there are adults and parents in their lives that care for them and that are seeking their best interest.
Children can't protect themselves. It's not their responsibility. They don't know how. They often sometimes don't even know that it's abuse because they have been led by the perpetrator to believe that that behavior is okay.
And it's so important that if the individual who's come across this kid who they suspect something's wrong, the kid's told them something in confidence, that they're witnessing something that doesn't feel right, that they have that choice at that moment to act, to take care of a kid, to potentially change a trajectory.
You may be the thing that protects that child from a lifetime of stigma, shame, misery. You may be the only person that actually can step in and change that child's life, change the trajectory of their life toward health and safety. And so that really is the role of somebody, an adult who suspects abuse.
If you have no children yourself, there can be advocacy that happens on your part, that you can contribute and bring this issue. This can be a conversation you have at the dinner table with your family.
I think a lot of parents are afraid to talk to their children about their bodies. It's just uncomfortable. I think culturally, you think religious beliefs, you think cultural beliefs, it becomes uncomfortable for people. And I think that normalizing these conversations is the first step.
Sexual abuse happens because of secrecy. And the more comfortable we are talking about these things and teaching kids, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, who to report to, how to know when something, is crossing a boundary, the more likely we are to be able to detect things early and to prevent them from getting hurt down the line.
Some states have their own statewide hotlines, but in every state in the U.S., you can call 911 and report suspected child abuse, and law enforcement will help or direct you to the right place to help. And in every country around the globe, you can report child sexual abuse to law enforcement. So if you're uncertain, then make that first call to law enforcement, and they can make sure to get you to the place that you need to go.
It's not a matter just of accusing someone. You're not accusing, you're sharing your reasonable suspicion that something is happening. And then let the professionals determine what that may or may not be. Turn it over to the people who know what they're doing, who can figure it out, who can help make that child's voice heard, who can protect that child.
Be someone who believes in children when they, come and when they make disclosures. You want to be a person who knows where they would report such a thing, right? Know the laws in your state. What's the phone number that you would call to find assistance for this child?
In general, for children's advocacy centers, referrals come from law enforcement and child welfare. Now, that doesn't mean that a concerned person can't call a children's advocacy center. But in that case, legally in every country and in the US, across all 50 states, there's a specific way that investigative agencies need to be notified and that they actually are the ones then responsible for conducting the investigation. But if you're uncertain and you don't know how to handle it in your community, call your local children's advocacy center because they deal with these cases every day. You'll still have to make that referral or that phone call to an investigative agency like law enforcement or child welfare, but they can walk you through that process.
What I've learned through my experience is that children don't have the problem talking about it. It's adults that create the barrier to children talking about it.
If a child discloses sexual abuse to you, the most important thing is to, make them feel safe. Let them know that you heard them, that you believe them, that you are going to take care of the situation, that you are proud of them for telling you. It is a very hard thing for somebody to come forth and tell somebody about sexual abuse.
Just ask open-ended questions. So, I see this happen to you. I see this bruise on you, or I see you didn't seem to be talking today.
It's about that trusting space that the child can or teenager can feel that they can speak about this and that they're not going to be in trouble. That's another big part of it. Kids who experience trauma oftentimes feel if they come forward, they'll be in trouble.
We encourage people, of course, to report if they have a reasonable suspicion of abuse. And that's the standard. That's all you have to have is a reasonable suspicion. But let's start with pick up the phone, call law enforcement, call child abuse hotline, call child protective services, but report.
When it comes to this issue, that change can happen really quickly, right? It really starts with a conversation. So even if the country is not on board or the larger society is not on board, you can do this work in your own home.
There are other things you can do. You can share messages of safety and protection on social media. You can make sure that the neighbors and kids and families and friends you have are also aware that kids can be vulnerable to child sexual abuse. So I think we have to think of ourselves as a vehicle for sharing safety information with the people who are in our circle of concern and also keeping an eye on the kids who are around us and deserve our protection.
It starts with one child feeling comfortable and then the next generation, right, where that support doesn't disappear. Right? It creates healthy adults. Healthy children grow up to be healthy adults. So change can happen really quickly.